which is interesting and funny. I mean, they asked me if I would like to uh, gender case sensitive it. Do you want to be Rabba Umora? Um, in the reform movement, largely, A, we don't think about it, but B, Rav is considered sort of a gender neutral term as
Yeah.
just teacher, even though it is definitely gendered as male. So
But isn't it redundant to say Rav and Mora?
it can be, Marcia. I think that you're not wrong there because the chief profession of a rabbi is teaching, but maybe it is, let's
Not
say,
pre.
repetitively redundant, like a fugitive on the run.
Well done.
It's a
Doesn't it
very
mean like my great? Rav is great. Ravi, my great.
yeah,
So what is
absolutely. So I hope that all the advance hype is true and that I'm a great teacher. But
what does Rabbah mean though? I keep wondering about that.
sorry, say again.
What does Rabbah mean? Because it's not the feminine version of rabbi. So what does it mean?
Well, I think that that's probably best answered by somebody who has taken the title for themselves. So for instance, Rabbi Sarah Horowitz, who is the first person to hold that title, um, Rabbi Wendy Amsalem, who has taught at CBST
What?
and CBST retreats on occasion, uses it sort of interchangeably with rabbi. And so most frequently I hear it with ordinees of Yeshivat Maharat. Um, Sarah Horowitz was privately ordained by Avi Weiss, who is the founder and the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Maharat. Um, yeah, it's an interesting question, Lisa. I think it's in part to like make the word common and it like easy to hear since it's already, especially in the communities where many of these Maharats operate, like a very controversial thing to say. Um, but I would love to invite somebody who uses it as their title instead of Maharat, instead of Rabbi, instead of Rav. Hear what they think about it.
Yeah.
What a fabulous way to start this class. We are, in fact, looking very closely at Hebrew language and, discussing it on a level. We're taking all of these familiar Hebrew prayers and phrases and poetry, but we're diving in much deeper. And we're looking at it in terms of both its linguistic clues to how we can understand its story, its history, its sociology, its politics, its agenda, maybe who the author is behind it. The language is available to us. It has all of these clues embedded within it. And so that's one of the reasons why I wanted to offer this particular class, using the Siddur as a textbook. It's pretty common for us to, at CBST and in any synagogue community, make sure that we're constantly offering content about the liturgy that we so often recite together, increasing all of our understanding and our exposure. But what really excited me about this and what I'm really nerding out about is all of the potential that's hidden in the Hebrew itself. Um, so I'm going to spend just a couple minutes doing a little bit of orientation, and I will repeat this because I know not this is some Wednesday to start a class. I know not everybody who plans on being here is here. First thing I want to say is this class is being recorded, and you should have received in the email with your confirmation of registration, reminding you that the class was actually happening, a link that has an archive of all of the class recordings. So if you ever miss one, you can just go to that website. It's a private website on the CBST page. You can't get there unless somebody gave you the link. And you can listen to any of the classes. You can re-listen. You can listen for the first time if you had to miss. The page exists in the internet forever, so you can go back at absolutely any time. But just remember, friends, that this is semi-public space. It is a protected and sacred classroom space where questions are welcome, and there is no such thing as a stupid question. Questions are really, really important. And sometimes the simplest questions are the ones that are most revelatory in all of our learning. But remember, it's being recorded. So maybe don't share like intensely personal information that you would not want somebody else to have access to on the internet. Along those lines, we are at CBST instituting a new policy. Bruce and Babette are lovingly running the tech for me tonight in our opening class, but going forward, I am my own technician, which means that, many of you know me and know I'm fairly technically competent. Don't worry, I'll be able to share my screen with great success, we hope. But it's difficult for me to be both the AV technician and the teacher at the same time. So if you have any technical questions, the CBST tech line is always open. It's at the bottom of our website, so you can see it anytime. Go to cbst.org and you'll see that number that you can call or text for some tech support. Use it liberally. That's what it's there for. But also, I am going to close the classroom door, literally and figuratively, at 6:10 every night. And if you aren't in the class at 6:10, you're in the waiting room, because I don't want to constantly be checking the waiting room. We'll never get past my first sentence if I'm always spending time being like, is this person on my class roster? Yes, okay. Arrive at 6 o'clock for class to start, so you don't miss any of our fantastic conversation. And also know that if it's 6:10, I'm not letting people in from the waiting room. It's nothing personal, it's just so I can concentrate. And the class is being recorded, so you can always go to the website and see what you missed. But does that sound clear and fair to everybody in the class? All right, I'm getting thumbs up, I'm getting nods, and I really, really appreciate it. This is going to be one of those weird occasions where we don't run on Jewish Standard Time. The class is going to start at 6, not at 6:10 or 6:12. We are, as I advertised in the class, the Hebrew that we're looking at is deeply familiar. It should be intimate. I see in this Zoom screen so many people who are regular Friday night, Saturday night service goers, for whom Shabbat services in their fullness and all of the ways that we celebrate in Jewish community are deeply familiar and a part of your practice for all of your life, much of your life, or as soon as you found them, you dove into the deep end of the pool. We are offering this class on a slightly higher Hebrew level, which means that I'm not going through each of the texts we read and translating it perfectly. Sometimes I will highlight certain words so we can see their roots, so we can see the way that these words are built upon as themes in a particular piece of liturgy. And you're always welcome to ask for, what is the root of this? How would you translate that? Lovingly, I might ignore you. If it's something that I feel you could probably find if you were looking at a translation, if you have the CBST Siddur at home, for instance, that's a great textbook for this class. I'm always going to be sharing a PDF so that we can look at the text together, and specifically so I can highlight and point and annotate and do all these things to the text. But I'm not always, sometimes you'll luck out and the text page has the transliteration on it, or it has the translation, or maybe both on it, and that's fantastic. I'm not going to go find those pages in our class. So if you'd always like to have that close at hand, all you need is your CBST Siddur. And frankly, 95% of the things that we're going to study together are in most Siddurim. We did not invent the blessing for Shabbat candles here at CBST. We did invent a really beautiful Aleinu L'Shabeach that we are going to study together. But this is all fairly accessible to you on the internet, on your bookshelf. And if you'd like closer translation help, feel free to ask those questions, and maybe it'll send me on a tangent that delights me, or it's a perfect segue into the next thing I wanted to talk about. But don't be terribly offended if I don't take the question that's on a more basic Hebrew level. I am so, so happy that there are members of our Aleph Hebrew classes in this class, that you've started your Hebrew journey maybe over the summer or maybe just recently. This class should offer you a lot. And if some of it is going over your head in terms of the Hebrew, there's no test at the end. Hopefully this is a way that all of us can dig deeper, especially into the Friday night service. But these pieces of liturgy show up everywhere in Jewish life and Jewish community. We are, as far as CBST online classes go, actually not that large. Only 40 people registered for this class instead of the 90 that are often in Psalms class. But it's still kind of a big class. I'll stop periodically, especially in breaks as we can reflect on a certain piece of liturgy that we've studied together. You're always welcome to raise your hand, especially virtually. It's easier for me to see the little icon that says Sally raised a hand instead of Marcia wildly waving at me from within the Zoom box. I might miss that. I see that though, Marcia. So you're always welcome to raise your hand as soon as I'm ready to stop on whatever tear that I'm on. I will call on you. And you can put questions in the chat, and I will try to periodically return to the chat to make sure that I pick up everything that seems like it would be really wonderful and additive. And then, of course, we only have a 60-ish minute class tonight, definitely only 60 minutes because we've got an election reflection at 7. And then the Shiva Minyan for Devorah Stahl, may her memory be for blessing, at 8. If I could impose on our CBST technician to share those Zoom links in the chat so that everybody has them really close at hand. The election reflection at 7 p.m. and the Shiva Minyan this evening at 8 p.m. That's where I'm heading directly after this class. So I think that's everything I wanted to say all at once. Be patient with me and each other. Sometimes it takes more than a minute for a class to get into a groove. So tonight, my wild and crazy dream is that we will study the blessing for the Shabbat candles, Shalom Aleichem, and a poem by Chaim Nachman Bialik, Hachama Merosh, which is about the Sabbath Queen. And those will be the 3 pieces of text we study tonight, if I can get through everything. And if we stop somewhere along the way, that's totally fine. Not in every class session will we try to tackle tons of text. Maybe we'll just focus on one particular thing. And sometimes we'll do like a light jump from one to the next, and there may be more than 3 things that we study together. And some of that depends on, like, as we get into a groove and feel more like a classroom community instead of a random collection of people who are all interested in the same thing, which probably bodes well, I'll have a better understanding as a teacher about how deep we want to go into certain text, how much we want to accomplish, and sort of a flavor for what the class loves to learn. As a starting point, I would really love if you would put into the chat your favorite prayer or your favorite Hebrew addition to the Shabbat service. You can name anything. You can name a formal piece of liturgy like the Shema. You can name a song that we sing. You can name the Yehuda Amichai poem, May I Rest in Peace. All of these are Hebrew prayers that are included in the CBST Siddur. I am loving these awesome suggestions. We've got Ahavat Olam, Shalom Rav, multiple votes for Oseh Shalom and Lecha Dodi, multiple votes for Hashkivenu, Eitz Chaim, selections from the Psalms, Adon Olam. And I want you to really quick, it doesn't take very long to scroll through, to take a look, see if anybody else picked your favorite. Or as you're looking over this selection of incredible Hebrew offerings that make up a Shabbat service, specifically at CBST and also all around the Jewish world, maybe you'll light up and say, you're right, Psalm 93 is fantastic. What I wanted to show also from this plurality and also this similarity of the things we love about the Shabbat service is we have very eclectic taste when it comes to Hebrew prayers. What I can see already just from like a cursory glance is that we have some prayers that are written in biblical Hebrew, in Torah-itic Hebrew, which is a massive monolith that covers hundreds and possibly like 1,000 years. And you can imagine how much language changes in that time, but you see even in the traditional Torah, the 5 books of Moses, a remarkable differentiation of how Hebrew is used, what names are used for God, perhaps even who is the writer, the voice behind the writing. And then you also have piyutim, lots of beautiful liturgical poems, many of them and probably most of that corpus belonging in the medieval period when Hebrew takes a massive leap in terms of what it means to be a language. You have some pieces that were brought in by the rabbis of the Talmud. and much of the codified nature of our prayer, the formulas that we recognize and that we say, come from that period. Sometimes we've got prayers in Aramaic, which sound a lot like Hebrew, but it was the spoken vernacular of the time of the Mishnah and Talmud. So it's got many of those roots, but it isn't exactly the same. And there's plenty of beautiful contemporary and modern pieces. Somebody mentioned Lador Vador, which is a great one. Hebrew is a language that has evolved. And while we're not necessarily focusing on Hebrew, the spoken language, which has a unique story in the history of languages as practically a resurrection, a language that wasn't spoken except for in these sacred spaces, which is why this class is called Lashon Kodesh, the holy tongue, to being a language that you would use to talk to somebody when your refrigerator breaks down. What you can see throughout the Siddur, and what sometimes we often don't pay attention to, are the many different points in Jewish history and across the Jewish world that are represented in the language themselves. And maybe we've wondered to ourselves, why is this particular prayer sounding like this while the one immediately next to it sounds like that? How did we come to this particular name for God in this prayer, which seems so perfect, or which seems so wrong and out of place? Those are the kind of things that we're going to look at together. Somebody asked, do we ask questions by raising our hands? Yes, please virtually raise your hand if you know how to do that. That's under the participants tab. And feel free to put things into the chat. I also recognize that within this classroom, we have people of very, very deep knowledge base and experience. We have poets and academics. We have Jewish professionals of all stripes. We have members of clergy, cantors, rabbis. We have people who practice all sorts of faith traditions. And this is something that we want to learn from one another. So I welcome all kinds of responses and reflections on the prayers that we study. And I think with that, let's actually look at a prayer. So the very first thing we're going to look at is the candle blessing, Hadlakat Nerot. Can everybody see the CBST Siddur page that I am sharing? You should see the Hebrew blessing, the English, the transliteration, and the Russian. Success? Great. If you are looking along in your CBST Siddur, we are on page 38. And I am going to focus on the Hebrew itself. Can I have a Hebrew reader to read out loud for us the text of the candle blessing? Please raise your hand virtually or put into the chat for me. Great, Ira, perfect. Ira, I'm going to ask you to unmute. There we go.
You want the prayer or the introduction as well? Hadlakat Nerot Shel Shabbat.
Excellent, and keep going.
Baruch Ata Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam Asher Kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu lahadlik ner shel Shabbat.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Ira. And it's really important to me that we spend some time, oops, sorry, I think I asked you to unmute again. You can just ignore me. That we spend some time reading these things out loud and hearing them spoken. So often we are carried away by the beautiful, beautiful music, which adds these transcendent layers to our prayerful experience. I am not discounting music, but sometimes we don't necessarily hear the rhyme scheme or the assonance or notice the metaphor. So it's really helpful, even if we know these prayers by heart, we've said them every Shabbat for as long as we can remember, or, we memorize them so we wouldn't have to worry so much about them, to hear them recited, because you notice all kinds of different things. So this prayer is following a very specific formula. Baruch Ata Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam. This is the way that all Jewish blessings start. And this is something that was codified in the Talmud. You don't see this in the Torah. You don't see anything that starts with Baruch Ata Adonai. We're going to get into exactly why and how is it that the rabbis decided all of these prayers should follow that structure. I learned it as the bracha formula, A plus B equals bracha. We're going to do that when we get closer into the blessings of the Mariv service, the Shema Uvirchotecha, the Shema and the blessings that surround it. But it's a helpful introduction here because this prayer is masquerading as a Talmudic prayer when it's actually much later. So you've got your bracha formula, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, and then you have the corollary, the syntax that we use when we're specifically completing a mitzvah. Asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav vitzivanu. And then what is the thing that you're doing? Lahadlik ner shel Shabbat. This is also a rabbinic precept, and it's really lovely. This is a reference to a brit, a covenant. This is showing our partnership in relationship with God and creation. That the sun's going to set on Friday no matter what, right? Whether or not we lit those candles, God's creation is working in the rabbinic mind. However, it's not sanctified. It's not becoming a mitzvah unless we take part in it. And so we are the ones who are sanctified, asher kidshanu, with this mitzvah, usually referring to one of the commandments, but we're going to get there because this one definitely doesn't. We're taking this on ourselves. We're taking hands with God in partnership to light these candles of Shabbat. And notice specifically how these are nerot, lahadlik ner, nerot, and it's not or, it's not kindling the lights of Shabbat. It's very specifically, ner in Torah Hebrew means a candelabrum, and an oil lamp is often how it's thought of. Remember that candles are actually a pretty recent invention in human history. So this looks just like a Talmudic prayer. It follows all the rules. How do we know that it's not from the Talmud? Because, my friends, in fact, lighting candles is a political act, and it was an act of resistance in Jewish history following certain political divides in Jewish culture. Usually, when we say a bracha, we say the bracha and then we do the thing. If you're going to eat food and you're going to recite a bracha over it, it's considered very rude. It's offensive to God if you eat the thing and then say the blessing. You're stealing from God in the rabbinic imagination. However, on Shabbat, we have to first light the candles and then say the bracha. Why? Virtually raise your hand or put into the chat. Where did my chat go? I'm going to stop screen share really quickly. So why do you have to say the bracha after you light the candles? Who knows one? Brian. Tell us.
Because once you light the candles and Shabbat's you say the blessing and Shabbat has happened, so you're not allowed to light the candles.
Exactly. Well done. And well done everybody who was saying it in the chat. So this is another instance of partnership with God, right? Shabbat happens, but we have a very specific timing about the lighting of candles. That's why you've got those candle lighting times, so that you don't accidentally light it during Shabbat when you're not supposed to light things on fire. What is the mitzvah that's associated with Shabbat in the Torah? It's don't light things. It's one of the forbidden kinds of work. How ironic, we might say, that we begin Sabbath with a thing that you are explicitly not supposed to do according to Exodus. It will get you stoned to death. When does lighting candles for Shabbat become a Jewish practice? We didn't inherit it from the Torah. It's not mentioned anywhere. In the Talmud, in Tractate Shabbat, it said that this is a nice practice. It brings shalom bayit. You can have a nice Shabbos meal lit by candles, and if you don't have candles, you're tripping over each other. That's no way to welcome Shabbat. But then you get into some really hairy halachic territory. So in rabbinic Judaism, there were two groups called the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And for those of you who are familiar with the New Testament, you might have heard this story before, that these were two rival groups who were fighting for political control in Jerusalem and in the Jewish monarchy, which was started by the Hasmoneans following the Hanukkah story. The Pharisees are the eventual winners of this, and they are the precedents of rabbinic Judaism. The Pharisees believe that the rule should be, if you've got a light lit and Shabbat happens, you can leave it alone. Anything you've got lit can last you through all of Shabbat. The Sadducees believe that if you have anything lit in your house and it's Shabbos, you have to douse it. You have to cut the light off. So what do the Pharisees do to sort of indicate their power? They double down and they say, nope, it is not Shabbat until you bring in the light. You have Shabbat comes after you light that last thing with this blessing that says, I receive Shabbat upon me. And then you don't douse anything and you don't turn off your crock pot. That's what the Pharisees say. It so happens that the Pharisees didn't write a blessing for this particular bracha. You see lots and lots of different blessings that are codified in the Talmud. You see, the precept that you should say 100 blessings a day in order to really offer your gratitude to God. And there are so many things that you can bless. So many of those blessings are in the Talmud, not the candle blessing. Didn't used to be a thing that you blessed. This was the realm of women. Women in the rabbinic imagination are not supposed to have to complete time-bound mitzvot. And we could get into all of this. Why not? What is the status of women? There are 3 exceptions to this rule. There are 3 time-bound commandments that women should complete. And their acronym spells out the name Hannah, who's a very favorite Jewish matriarch, the mother of Samuel, who we heard about on Rosh Hashanah, one of the Annunciation stories, a childless woman who is then given a child through her prayer, and the first person to pray by themselves, making up their own spontaneous liturgy. What are the 3 things that make up Chana? Challah, the making of challah. Nida, ritual purification, which also incidentally tends to work around a Shabbat calendar. And Hadlakat Nerot, the lighting of candles. Those are the 3 mitzvot that women are not exempt from that do have some kind of time-bound quality. But as frequently we see in a heteronormative patriarchal culture, the work of women doesn't attain the same honorific status that the work of men does. That's not to say it's not appreciated and given its place, but there isn't a blessing in particular in the Talmud for this act until the argument comes around again. So there is a movement which is started by, I'm looking up exactly his name, Anan, the son of David, and his followers are called the Karaites. And the Karaites are calling for a return to pre-rabbinic Judaism. This is in the 8th century, which takes us out of the Talmudic period. The Mishnah was codified around 500 CE. We're looking at 2nd and 3rd century for all of the pieces of the Talmud to come together. This is 8th century. If you're looking in Jewish historical timeline, that's called the Geonic period, the period of the geniuses. And during this time, Anan ben David and his followers, the Karaites, were saying that all you have to look at is what is kra, what is written, not what is oral law in the Talmud. And so, because it is specifically prohibited to light anything on Shabbat, the Karaites say you shouldn't do candle lighting as part of your Shabbat practice. You need to follow the Torah's definition of Shabbat. The Karaites aren't completely wiped out. We don't see any Sadducees anymore, but you do see tiny Karaite communities across the world. I visited a Karaite temple in the Crimean Peninsula. It was then in the Ukraine when I went, but it's a very, very, very tiny minority. The majority, go with the statements of rabbinic Judaism. And so the Geonim double down again and say, not only should you light fire and then keep it lit through Shabbos, you shouldn't douse it. We're going to make it holy. We're going to offer a blessing. We're going to say that it is one of the mitzvot. And the way that they say this is in Deuteronomy. It says you should always follow the sages going forward. If you look in the Talmud describing the Hanukkah candles, it says that like, oh, so this was after the Torah, but it's still a mitzvah and it deserves these blessings. That's where they get their sort of halachic proof. So that text of the candle lighting blessing, that simple one line that we often don't think about, though it is the formal welcoming in of Shabbat, often in the home instead of in the synagogue, is rich and rife with political implications. And when we enact it, we are sort of remarking the battlefield of these Jewish political infightings throughout history and throughout time. So I want to pause for just a second. That was a lot on one line of Hebrew. Does anybody have any questions about the candle blessing itself or any reflections on this? Go ahead, Ira.
So we use the same exact prayer, except for the last Shel Shabbat part for holiday candles. When we say Shel Yom Tov, did that sort of evolve at the same time as the Shabbat?
So the rules for Shabbat and the rules for holy days as written in the Torah have those same prohibitions, no lighting, which meant that when it came to the Pharisees and the Sadducees, it was sort of all lumped together. You shouldn't have lights on Yom Tov either. So you can trace the genesis of that particular prayer to very similar timeframes. I'm not an absolute expert and I might be wrong. There might be a little difference of chronology there, but the argumentation follows the same pattern. David.
Yeah, I was wondering about the covering the eyes. Does that come from something that's in the prayer, or does it come from the same tractate of Talmud as what you were just talking about?
It's a minhag. It is a custom and not a rule, but it helps with that legal fiction, right? That you're not supposed to kindle lights on Shabbat. So if you cover your eyes and then, voila, look at how these Shabbat lights are here. I have no idea how they got there. Also, it's also like so many of these women's customs bring with it all of these pieces that are handed down over generations without a lot of explication in the way that we see in the Talmud. So it's not there, but it's
much
pretty
later.
familiar.
It sounds like. Okay, thanks.
And Cantor Allen.
So I just want to make sure I have the timeline right. So the Torah says, obviously, you can't light anything, you can't use it water, but the Pharisee, the whole idea of lighting came from the Talmud because it brings shalom by it. Therefore, we should light the candles. Therefore, we're going to actually create a blessing to go with that to make the holiness.
So the Talmud says we should have some candles for shalom bayit, but we're not. They don't need a blessing.
Right.
Yes, but the Pharisees think it's important, even without the blessing.
And then when was the blessing added? That's
Gaonic period, 8th century, when the Karaites were coming around. Sound good?
Thank you.
And no, a nice Jewish boy had to invent the crock pot for his mother sometime in, what was that? I don't know, the 30s. I'm completely making that up. But no, the crock pot did not necessitate the Shabbat candle blessing. All right, I'm going to call on Lisa and then Randy, and then we're going to move on to our next text. So go ahead, Lisa.
So this was a pushback in the 8th century. This is a pushback of the rabbis against the Karaites, or to establish.
I don't even know if I would. So pushback is right, but the rabbis were in power. The Karaites were the minority who were protesting
and wanted to keep them there.
Yes, the rabbis wanted to keep them there. And Randy.
So we say the prayer after we've lit the candles. So a technical question: when it gets to be the darkest day of the year, and we have to light our Shabbat candles before 5 o'clock, but CBST services don't start till 6:30. Do we say the prayer ourselves, or is it legit to wait to 6:30 and do it with everybody?
So we are delightfully unorthodox at CBST, as evidenced by your fabulous female rabbi who is teaching this class. Completely legit in many ways. However, common in traditional Judaism, light the candles at home, go to shul.
Thank you.
All right. Karaites is spelled K-A. If I remember, I will type it in there. Very close, Lisa, but not quite, but very close. Okay, so let's move on to our next text, which is going to be Shalom Aleichem. I'm going to scroll there in our CBST Siddur PDF. You can flip there in our CBST Siddur. We're on page 40. And can I have a Hebrew reader to read Shalom Aleichem? I think this is one of those particular pieces of liturgy that when read, you're going to hear so many, like the tightness of the poetic meter that we often get carried away with the music and don't get to notice. So can I have, I think Randy's hand is still up from the question, but if you
I'll
are
read. That's
willing
fine.
to read,
Sure.
go for it.
Shalom Aleichem, Malachi Hasharet, Malachi Elyon, Mi Melech, Malachi HaMalachim, Hakadosh Baruch Hu. Boachem L'Shalom, Malachi Hashalom, Malachi Elyon, Mi Melech, Malachi HaMalachim, Hakadosh Baruch Hu. Baruchuni L'Shalom, Malachi Hashalom, Malachi Elyon, Mi Melech, Malachi HaMalachim, Hakadosh Baruch Hu. Zeichem L'Shalom, Malachi Hashalom, Malachi Elyon, Mi Melech, Malachi HaMalachim, Hakadosh Baruch Hu.
Beautiful, and thank you. So what I want to do is look really closely at the Hebrew of this particular prayer. I'll give you the context. Again, not a Torah prayer. Probably doesn't surprise anybody. This was, I don't have the actual author of the poem. Sometimes we do. For instance, in Lachado D, Shlomo Alkabetz literally like embedded his name in an acrostic in all of the verses. We'll talk about that when we get there. That's how we know Alkabetz wrote it. We don't have this with Shalom Aleichem. The very first appearance of Shalom Aleichem was in a prayer book called Tikkunei Shabbat, which was published in Prague in 1641. How does Rabbi Rapport know these insane facts about Jewish publishing history? Rabbi Rapport had a very good teacher whose name is Rabbi Dr. Larry Hoffman, and he wrote a book series that I totally recommend to everybody. It's called My People's Prayer Book. It's published by Jewish Lights Publishing Company in Vermont. You too can learn when was the very first time Shalom Aleichem was published, and it became popular in the 18th century as a piece of liturgy. It was not universally popular. Some people have very deep problems with it, and we'll talk about why. Looking at the language of Shalom Aleichem, very interesting that we have Shalom Al, and that prefix in Hebrew means on. We might translate it idiomatically as like, peace be with you. That's not what the Hebrew says. And the reason is it's linked closely to a particular Torah verse. So this is found in the Psalms. The Psalms class is going to get there, but you have to wait a minute because it's Psalm 125 and Psalm 128. Shalom al Yisrael, peace be upon Israel, is the core of this phrase that gets turned into a commonplace greeting. When you're saying hello to somebody, you say Shalom Aleichem, Aleichem Shalom. Notice here, Malachi versus Mimelech Malchei Hamlachim. This phrase right here, Malchei Hamlachim, the King of Kings, is not biblical whatsoever. It's common in other ancient Near Eastern writings because everybody wanted to say their God was the King of Kings. And we often hear in the Psalms this phrase, in Psalms class, some people are actually quite uncomfortable with it, but you see it in other places in the Torah too, that God is the greatest of all the gods. However, this phraseology of King of Kings isn't common until the era of Shalom Aleichem. And Hakadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One Blessed Be, is one way that you could translate it. You see that in the Talmud. So in the Bible, the Yud He Vav He is increasingly common, though not in every book of the Bible. And that's one of the ways that we can sort of divine what authorship is if we're following literary criticism theory, the documentary hypothesis that says that the Bible might be a compilation of many voices over time, and those voices may have used different names for God in their community. Some of them may be more female identified, some of them may be more male identified, some of them are non-binary. The proliferation of many names for God starts in the Talmudic era and goes forward from there. But you don't see in the Torah ever God being referred to as HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So this word malache is for angels. And notice the aleph in the middle that differentiates it from that same root for kingship or sovereignty. Where do the angels come from? The malache elyon mimelech malche hamlachim. Listen to that beautiful repetition. It's a homophone. It's meant to be that way. They aren't actually the same root, but they're so closely entwined together. And I don't know if everybody, maybe it was only just me who didn't notice this gorgeous refrain at the end. Every single verse of Shalom Aleichem ends the same way. So what does this come from? There is a Talmudic story, which is really beautiful, that I bet plenty of people have heard before. It comes in Tractate Shabbat, where all the good things about Shabbat happen. And the story goes that when you're going home from Shabbat services, there are two angels that follow you. There's a good angel and there's a bad angel. We're not going to get into like the goodness or the badness of angels. There are two angels, one's good and one's bad. If when you enter your home and it's set for Shabbat, the beds are freshly made is really important to the rabbis, and the table is set and the candles are lit, the good angel says, may it be so for every Shabbat. And the bad angel has to say, Amen. However, if you enter your home and it's dark and it's a mess and it's not, it's unnoticeable that you've moved from the week into Shabbat, the bad angel says, may it be so. And the good angel has to say, Amen. So this is the sort of like source story about this idea that angels surround us for Shabbat especially. There's a really beautiful and complex, intricate angelology in Jewish tradition. Some people think that, angels are sort of a like New Testament creation, very much not so. And the idea that you're surrounded by a host of angels is a really beautiful idea. You see it in the Kedusha as well, and we'll get there. But what are we saying to these angels? We're saying shalom and welcome, and then we're saying boachem l'shalom, come in peace, barchuni l'shalom, bless in peace, and seitchem l'shalom, go in peace. And so this is not an accidental structuring. That you have this verse in Deuteronomy, it's Deuteronomy 28:6, that says, Bruchim atem bevoachem, blessed are you in your coming, uvruchim atem b'tseitchem, blessed are you in your going, or in your coming out, which is the way that CBST loves to translate it for our special prayer for coming out. And so that's what we're playing on here poetically, that you're blessing the angels in their coming and you're blessing the angels in their leaving, which is what you're supposed to do for all people. God does this for us. Notice too, this really tiny preposition, which like you're going to say, Rabbi Rapport, why are you obsessing about this? But seitchem l'shalom. This is weird if you translate it, and this really helps to illustrate the specificity of the grammar. That's saying, instead of go in peace or go with peace, that would be seitchem bishalom, not seitchem lishalom. Lamed before a word is to. So that's saying go to peace. Why is that? There is another very interesting Talmudic teaching, which talks about why you should never say to somebody bishalom and always say to somebody lishalom. So in Brachot, it says, if you leave a friend, you shouldn't say go in peace. You shouldn't say bishalom. And you see some people will use as their email sign off bishalom or lishalom. And I always find it really interesting who does what. Because Yitro said to Moses, Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, told him to go to peace, lishalom, in the book of Exodus. Who used bishalom? King David, to his son Absalom. And what happened to Absalom? He got hung by his hair. So if you want to send somebody with blessings of peace, you should say lishalom. However, it is common for us to speak of those who are departed, for us to address the dead with bishalom. So there's actually a lot of Jewish superstition inlaid into this linguistic reality. And so the only time we would say go in peace is when we're speaking of the dead. And this is what God said to Abraham, referencing his coming death. One of the reasons why people, we love Shalom Aleichem. It's in every Siddur, pretty much, and it never waned in its popularity. However, people tried, and this is going to be a really interesting story as we move through the liturgy. What are the prayers that people tried to get rid of, but they were way too popular and no one could get rid of it? Kol Nidre is an example of that. There were some rabbis who hated Kol Nidre, but it was like too popular. Their communities would mutiny if they tried to take it out. Shalom Aleichem is one of those. Some people were, the early Reform movement in the 19th century hated the idea of angels. It really freaked them out. It sounded like way too Christian for them, and it sounded way too mystical and superstitious. They wanted a Judaism that they could bring to their universities. Angels did not line up with that. For the people who did believe in angels, however, they didn't like the idea of telling the angels to leave. Don't you want the angels to hang around? So some people, the way they solve that is they don't sing that last stanza of Shalom Aleichem. They only sing these first three. And some people just don't sing it all together. It was not universally popular, but we love it at CBST. So I'm going to take a pause. And are there any questions or reflections about Shalom Aleichem, its language, or the poem itself? Go ahead, Jeffrey.
Okay, I'm hesitant to ask this question. It may sound stupid. It may not be even relevant.
What did I say about stupid questions? There are none.
But when I've gone to weddings or bar bat mitzvahs, when the person entered, like the bride and the bridegroom entered the reception room, they would sing Shalom Aleichem. I wonder if this is the same Shalom Aleichem they're singing, or
interesting. Honestly, Jeffrey, I'm not sure. I could see it working because, you want a person to be followed by blessing and followed by angels. But it's not a custom I'm familiar with. That doesn't mean it's not a custom that's wide in the Jewish world that I just haven't participated in.
Every wedding I went to, when the person came in, they would sing that song. That's what I was asking.
I'm glad you did. Thank you. Jesse.
Didn't I have this memory that Debbie Friedman wrote a different last verse because she didn't like the going out thing.
Interesting.
No, maybe Sherry, do you know?
I was about to say, Cantor Allen, do you have any insight on this?
Yeah, right.
That is news to me, but I am going to find out.
All right. So next Wednesday, Jesse, we're going to return to that question.
Okay, I can ask Joe Eglash and he'll tell me, I'm sure.
Please bring back to class.
Okay.
What I can tell you is that, Debbie wrote beautiful settings of Shalom Aleichem, and it was one of her last compositions, if not the last that she was working on. Thank you for bringing that to us. Andrea, and then Ruth.
I'm a little confused about this. I'm sorry, Lishalom and Bishalom, because I get many messages from people from my other shul, and a lot of times they'll end it by saying Bishalom.
So it's grammatically correct. You want someone to go with peace. If you're a good Hebrew speaker, that's exactly how you would render it. However, if you're a Talmud scholar, you'd know that story about use the one that Yitro used and not the one that King David used. So it means your other shul is really good at Hebrew.
Thanks. I was just a little confused. Okay.
No problem. Ruth, what's on your mind?
Well, I had mentioned this in the chat, but you said that King of Kings was not something that was commonly used. here it's first used in the 1600s. Curiously, Handel's Messiah also uses that. It's a big thing in the in Handel's Messiah. And I wonder whether the author may have picked it up from the Christian world that he was living in.
So what I can say, I can't actually speak to that specifically, but it's not so uncommon that liturgies reflect each other and the places where they were living. So we'll get into the unique girdle poem that is Lecha Dodi, that was common in the Arab world in songs that were written about the Quran. And if you translate the Kodesh, which we might get to, you'll hear it sounds very much like Our Father who is in heaven, hallowed be thy name. We all drink the same water and breathe the same air. And if we're in a moment of a lot of cultural transmission, we talk to each other and we read each other. Not so uncommon. Great observation. All right, and Darina wants to know, what is hasharet? The root sharet means serve. So these are like angels in the service of, or angels who serve. Look at us, friends. We got 10 minutes. We're going to look at the Bialik poem. So what I wanted to do in this particular class, we won't get quite this spread every single time, but we looked at a piece of liturgy and a piece of Hebrew writing that was Geonic of the 10th century and like 8th to 10th century, but masquerading as Talmudic Hebrew. We looked at Shalom Aleichem, which is from the 16th, 18th century. And now we're going to look at a modernist piece that we often sing at CBST. It's particularly beloved, and you might hear it this Friday night. So you actually have to turn back in the CBST Siddur. I wanted to save it for the end because if we didn't get to something, I would have rather it been this. I had to prioritize. But it's one of our opening songs frequently. And it is on page, come back here, The Sabbath Queen. This is page 31 if you're following along in your physical CBST Siddur. And can I have a reader for this Bialik poem? Ruth, your hand is up. I don't know if that's like a holdover from the question. Nope, no thank you, no reading. Anyone else want to volunteer to read this? It's a beautiful, beautiful poem.
I'll read it, Aura.
Thanks, Aura. Oops, wait, you're muted, so please go ahead. Still muted. Aura, we're not hearing you, but I really appreciate
I'm not on screen share. I can't see it. I see.
Oh, okay. Here,
I see.
Let me stop the screen share and restart it and see if that helps you. Here we go. Because if you're having that problem, I bet other people are having that problem too. Can you see it now? It says Shabbat Hamalka at the top.
Yep.
Great.
Hachamame Rosh Ha'ilanot Nistalka, Bo v'neitzeh likrat Shabbat Hamalka. Hine hi yoredet hakdusha habrucha, v'ima malachim tzva shalom u'menucha. Boi boi hamalka, boi boi hakala. Shalom aleichem malachei hashalom.
Gorgeous, and thank you. Something that I wanted, that I lovingly, this is how I read it too, but what's beautiful in particular about the way that Bialik wrote Hebrew was he was writing it in Ashkenazi Hebrew. So just to teach us a little bit about Bialik's biography, because he really was a fascinating figure in terms of the history of Hebrew writing, as especially Hebrew poetry. He was born in Zhytomyr, which was a deeply, deeply Hasidic place. And so he was influenced by Hasidut, you know, the ecstatic expressions, the democratization that everybody could take a part in praising God, especially the storytelling culture. Yet he went to yeshiva in, hang on, I have to look up where he went to yeshiva, but it was in Lithuania. So he was a Chassid and also a Litvak, which it is another like Jewish political divide. The Lithuanian style of education, this is where Musar the study of Jewish ethics, like Rabbi Moskowitz is doing these Musar meditations in the morning, comes from, and it's highly codified, like it's practically algebraic in its approach, rather than this like ecstatic and swinging and open sense of access to Jewish text. So he's raised in Chassidut, he's educated in a yeshiva in a Litvak tradition, and then he moves to Odessa, inspired by Achad Ha'am, who was one of the early Zionists, also a really talented poet himself, who was part of this renaissance of writing in Hebrew. And Bialik lived most of his life in Odessa, but in the last decade of his life, along with Achad Ha'am and a couple other luminary thinkers who were part of this Aliyah movement, he moved to Israel. And he is considered like a deeply beloved treasure of Israel, one of the national laureates of Israeli poetry, even though he only lived in Israel for 10 years. But think about the bravery it took to write in Hebrew, especially so immersed in Yiddish. And so Joyce Rosenzweig is always correcting me that instead of Hachama Merosh, it's Hachama Merosh. And it really needs to, if anybody's singing it, it needs to be pronounced with that Ashkenazi Hebrew patter, that instead of the ultimate syllable, stress on the last syllable, it's the penultimate syllable, it's the second to last syllable. So this very first word, and I don't know if anybody else is familiar with this in its English setting. I grew up in a classical reform congregation where we would always sing, "The sun on the treetops no longer is seen. Come, let us welcome the Sabbath, our queen." It was in the Union Prayer Book. We never let it go. Notice that we don't use the colloquial Hebrew word for sun. It's not shemesh, it's hachama. And this is specifically like already we are looking at very high intellectual poetic Hebrew language, which is a level above what you might have sung in the woods if you're part of a Hasidic davening circle, but also is just so beautiful, and it gives this sense of gently illuminating light. Notice too the reference to Shalom Aleichem, Malachei HaShalom. So that's one of the reasons why I wanted to place it here. You've got the background of Shalom Aleichem, and that was definitely like written deep into Bialik's bones. But he's also, so this poem is called Shabbat HaMalkah, though he does reference later Boi Boi HaKala, as well as Boi Boi HaMalkah. These are two different references to the way that Shabbat is personified in the rabbinic imagination, but dates back to the mystics in Sfat, who really got into this idea. It was first written about in the Talmud, and you might have heard of these customs of, people would wear white and go out to meet the Sabbath bride as she arrived. And L'cha Dodi, which is what we study next week, is really focusing on that Kala image. And we'll talk about what the symbolism is. If Shabbat is a bride, then who is standing under the chuppah with said bride? And how do we treat said bride? And what does this mean for the way that we relate to Shabbat? But the image that Bialik wants us to leave with is not Shabbat as a bride, but Shabbat as a queen. And so this is a particular Talmudic citation. The one that we're much more familiar with is the Rabbi Yanai Boi HaKala, which we're going to see in L'cha Dodi. But there's also a citation that Rabbi Hanina would wrap himself in his prayer shawl as the sun was setting, and he would say, "Come, let us meet Shabbat HaMalkah, the Sabbath queen." And so we've got a beautiful piyut that has endured throughout Jewish history all across the world in L'cha Dodi, where we see Shabbat as a bride, but we don't see Shabbat as a queen quite that often. And it doesn't mean that, a bride can't be a queen and a queen can't be a bride. But what I love about the idea of Shabbat queen is when we welcome Shabbat at CBST, there's like no better metaphor. And in this sovereignty, we're sort of queering the idea of who holds power and who brings us into court, who is resplendent in glory. And that's one of the reasons that I really love this particular poem, and the way that Bialik put words to this image of Shabbat. And you can see also sort of a quiet reference to our candle lighting, that the sun is no longer seen. It has dipped below the treetops, which means it's safe for us to light candles. And we welcome Shabbat in. Again, it's this intimate relationship of receiving. You know, Shabbat chronologically was gonna happen with or without us, but the mitzvah is showing up, and the mitzvah is delighting and taking part in the creation of this most precious gift, the creation of rest, the creation of not creating anything. All right, it is 6:59, dear friends. Can I have our CBST tech people put into the chat the link for our election reflection gathering that's happening in 1 minute, and also the link for the Shiva Minyan tonight at 8 o'clock. The election reflection is really only going to take like 50-60 minutes so that we can be on time for Shiva. Thank you everybody so much for joining me in this class this evening. I will see you next week. We will move forward in the service. We will look at Kabbalat Shabbat. These were all the things that, like, in theory you did at home, but now we're going to move into the Psalms of Kabbalat Shabbat, with which I know many of you are familiar, so maybe we won't spend quite as long, maybe not 2 weeks on the subject, and L'chad Odi.
Thank you.
A pleasure. Roseanne, did you have a question? Your hand was raised. I wanted to make sure everybody knew like how to get where they were going, but happy to answer any questions.
All fine.
What?
All fine.
All fine. Glad to hear it. All right, everybody. So I will see you next Wednesday, maybe with a little less going on. And I'm wishing you chazak v'ametz, strength and courage as we move forward.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Early Shabbat Shalom.
Ready?